72 years ago, when Pandit Nehru wrote Discovery of India, we have Feroze Varun Gandhi, who has made a rather long attempt at rediscovering India. I know that Varun has a lot more to talk to you about, not just his book, so I'd like to not waste any more time and request Varun Gandhi to please come up and speak to you, ladies and gentlemen, before we move on to the next part of that session. Varun?
Hi. I would like to thank everybody here at Knowledge Factory for having me. I was in Brazil a couple of years ago, and I was at an event somewhat like this, and they said that a very respected army general would like to come up and say a few words about the state of the nation. And the audience was sort of lukewarm, they were a little disinterested. It was a very elite audience in the capital in Brasilia. And the general came and he said, well, I have only one thing to say, because I speak Spanish, so I sort of understand a bit of Portuguese. And he said, I have only one thing to say, which is all the politicians should be hanged or shot, and the country should be overthrown by the military. And everybody stood up and gave him a standing ovation as I squirmed quietly in my seat. He is now the Vice President of Brazil, Hamilton Mourão. And so I just want to talk a little bit about political reform. You know, when we look at the shocking election of Donald Trump, and when we look at Brexit, and when we look all across the world at what's happening, one of the things that we do understand is that the working class revolt is firmly in place against, there is a ferment against the status quo politically worldwide. You have a sense that globalization has failed to take along with it a lot of working class people. And you have a sense really that people who are bombastic, bold decisions in their syntax should come to the fore. I think that's completely the wrong way forward, but this is what I see happening. And that is why you have people like Donald Trump, you have people like, in a different way, you have left-wing politicians like Jeremy Corbyn, like Bernie Sanders, talking about the fact that the status quo, the elitism, the lack of transparency, etc., is really not working. One blames the rich, the other blames the other, which could be immigrants, Jews, Muslims, etc. But you see a lot of similar things happening on opposite ends of the spectrum. It got me thinking why this is happening. So when I came back from Brazil, I started reading up on their political situation. And I found that in the Petrobras scandal, in Dilma Rousseff's scandal, 66% of all existing members of parliament were found to be on the payrolls of the largest petroleum company of Brazil. And they didn't even deny it. 40% of MPs went to jail. 40% of MPs. I mean, that's when you have a military dictatorship coming to the fore. So what are we really talking about? When we look at America, right, which is supposed to be the apogee of political reform, is it really? I mean, when we look at just campaign finance reform as one issue, right, how do we fund elections? How does that contribute towards corruption and the degradation of a system? The Koch brothers, spelled K-O-C-H, the second richest family other than the Walton family, spent $800 million in the last American election. They spent $800 million, right? They first spent $80 million trying to defeat Donald Trump in the primaries, And then they spent 800 million trying to elect him. And all of you know, or many of you know about the system of super PACs, super political action committees, which is that you can raise unlimited amounts of money in America from rich individuals, corporations, trade unions, etc. 81% of all senators who've won and 80% of all governors who've won, which is like our chief ministers, took super PAC money, right? And, you know, I remember Vajpayee saying that every politician in India starts his election with a lie, which is his expenditure report. But the fact is, I did a RTI, which I'd be happy to share with you, which showed me something very frightening, which is that 82% of the time in 2014, the richest candidate fighting the election won. And 100% of the time, the poorest candidate fighting the election in 543 constituencies lost their deposit. So more than 80% of the time, the richest person fighting won, and 100% of the time, the poorest person lost their deposit. What does that say about where the last man in India is in Indian politics, right? So how do you fund elections? How do we go about it? So there is a lot of public funding of elections, which obviously in a country like ours, which is a poor country, we cannot really afford that. But if you look at elections as a whole, right, I'm going to talk about this later, there are lots of different models. I mean, in 11 African countries, they found that more than 50% of the official money that was taken by the largest political party was taken from international organizations, right? And when they did a deep dive into that, they found that more than 40% of this came from China, right? It's frightening and also interesting. So, you know, what do? Norway has a very interesting system, which is they don't control the amount of money that you can spend in election. You can spend anything you want, right? But there's no TV ads, there's no radio ads, there's no hoardings, there's no posters, there's no billboards, there's no public assembly more than 1,500 people, and the election end to end ends in 10 days. So really, they just control the market for where you can spend the money, because there's no way you can spend it. You know what? We have an election commission here. A lot of people praise the election commission. I think a lot of work they do is praiseworthy, but it's really not the strongest election commission that it can be. The election commission has no power to file cases once the election is over. They have no guidelines that have any binding authority in law. None, right? I mean, if you look at in India, how many elections have been countermanded, right? So 2 elections have been countermanded, both of them, oddly enough, in Patna. Right, in 1991, I.K. Gujral's election was countermanded. I don't know if any of you remember. And in 96, Shashi Kumar Sinha's election was countermanded in Patna for violence and open booth capturing, etc. Right? I mean, when we look at the election commission, the detailed work that it does versus the amount of funding that it does. So Sweden, with 7 million people, has twice the budget of our election commission for their election commission. 7 million people. The BSP case is particularly bizarre. When I was looking at, what to speak on today, I was thinking of speaking on political reform. So the BSP put their case to the election commission, which I looked at carefully, which talked about their donors, etc., which you have to do. Except in the same document, they stated that 86% of their donors had died. A little convenient? I don't know. I'm just asking a question. right? 86% of their donors dead. The Election Commission has deregistered one party in Indian history, and that's the late P.A. Sangma's party, whose name I'm not quite sure of, but I think it's called the National People's Party. And they deregistered it for the long sum of 1 day. So they didn't give their election expenditure reports or any reports for 3 years, and then they re-registered them, and then they gave the reports, and then they re-registered them. So not the most harsh punishment in the world, let's say. Germany has an interesting thing. So Germany, every party has a 90-second television ad, and it's proportionately placed as to how many votes you got in the last election. But the ad is codified to say that no negative ads will be allowed. So you're not allowed to run an ad saying so-and-so is a real scoundrel. You're only allowed to run an ad saying, we are the Christian Democratic Party, this is what we stand for, this is why you should vote for us. And it goes through a sort of INV scanner. I thought that was interesting. We don't even have a timeline by which to declare donations, how much we spend, etc. Right? So in Victoria, in Australia, they have to declare it within a week of receiving it. Right? And the reason that they got this law in place is, oddly enough, in the province of Victoria, they found that 70% of everybody who donated to political party were casinos. So they felt maybe something's wrong with our political process. So when I became a member of parliament 10 years ago, I decided not to draw a salary, because I felt that those of us who can afford it should not be a burden on the system. And I do a lot of, I speak a lot, and so I go to different places, and I kept speaking about this, that, and I wrote a letter to all members of parliament who have declared their income at more than 20 crores, which I felt was a fair asset declaration. And I wrote them all a letter, and I said, in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, was over 150 of them. And I said, would you voluntarily say no to your salary? I didn't get a single letter back, but a lot of people used to talk to me in Central Hall, stopped talking to me. I was earlier last year, I went to meet my mother who lives on Jantar Mantar Road, and right next door is where people agitate. And I saw a lot of farmers, from Tamil Nadu, and I went there and I spoke to them, and they were, agitating in the most, severe manner by shaving their heads and drinking their urine, and I was very disconcerted by this. And so I watched television in the evening that I met them, and the television said that the next day they would have a session in the Tamil Nadu Assembly. And I said, okay, that's great, because that shows that people have been receptive to this. And they did have an all-day session, except it was a session for MLAs to decide to double their own salaries. And I thought this was really grotesque, So I spoke in Parliament on this, and I spoke on this issue. And I said that we as MPs cannot or should not arrogate to ourselves the right to increase our salaries at will. There are a lot of professionals sitting here today, and all of you know how difficult it is to get a wage hike, and you need to prove yourself again and again. You need to work 120% of the time. You need to suck up to your boss, or, whatever. But you know how MPs and MLAs in this country increase their salary? This is how. That's exactly how. They raise their hands in Parliament, and boom, you have a salary increase. And I thought this was just terribly wrong. And I read about how in Denmark, all the MPs got together, 100% of them, and they said, we need a salary increase. The cost of living is too high, the standard of living of ours is too low, And the leading paper in Copenhagen did a front page poll. And they said everybody who's against this, who feel that these guys don't need or deserve a wage hike, please vote. And obviously the politicians lost the vote. And so the MPs, who by then constitutionally had got their wage hike, rejected it. Because they said if people don't want us to have it, then we don't have the sanctity to go through with this move. I don't know if in India it would quite work out the same way. And the fact is that, so when I did this, I went all over India and I spoke on this issue. And one day I got a call from the finance minister saying that come and see me. And he was kind enough to say that so many people like at the event at Knowledge Factory here, had emailed him and tweeted him and Facebooked him and whatever else him, and said that, this is an issue we feel strongly about, so for God's sake, do something. And so in the last budget, I was happy to know that they put a constitutional body into place which will now decide when and if MPs get a salary increase. And that was your doing. When we look at Parliament, right? So from 1952 to 1972, Parliament worked 130 days a year. For the last 15 years, Parliament has worked 60 days a year, right? So less than half. I guess people who are paid to work should work. Whenever you talk to a politician, a lot of people will say, but we've won the election, right? We're representatives of the public. So how can you talk to us? How representative are MPs really, right? Farooq Abdullah Saab just won his election. He got 4.4% of the vote. Is he representative of everybody in Srinagar? I don't know. But it's a question worth asking. I didn't get 50% of the vote in my constituency. And the first time I didn't, this time I got a little less. And so I called up the people who fought against me. And I said, listen, I don't feel that I have an overwhelming mandate. Plus, I'm not a local. So let's meet at one of your houses for a cup of tea and give me your plans for this constituency, because it's possible that you know and are better equipped to deal with a lot of these local problems. And let's run this constituency together. And that's exactly what I've tried to do. Everybody talks about women's reservation. I'm a proponent. I'm pro-women's reservation. But what kind of women's reservation are we looking at? We have women's reservation in UP, right? In Pradhans, in BDCs, in all these local bodies. And when you go there, you go on every stage and you have this hatta-katta guys, sitting next to you, about 7 of them. And then you see a woman wearing a ghungat sitting on this floor, and you say, where's the village Pradhan? And they point to that lady. And then you turn to the Hulk sitting next to you, and you say, who the hell are you? And he said, I'm a Pradhan Pati. And do you know that this phrase now has entered Niti Aayog reports? It has now become an official moniker. Pradhan Pati, BDC Pati, Vidhayak Pati. So is this the kind of women's reservation we need? Do we want it to descend to just tokenism? Right? Everywhere you just have wives and, mothers and daughters. So can we put in a clause saying that we need women from non-political backgrounds? I don't know. Can we? Wage pay disparity. It's a big issue. And I'm going to get to this a while later. Iceland is the first country that has made it illegal for a woman to be paid less than a man for the same job. It's the only country in the world. And I want to get to this a little while later. Getting back to Parliament, I just want to make 2 or 3 quick points. One, 64% of the legislation that has been passed in Parliament, 64% in the last 15 years has been passed without any discussion, not even 1 second. 64% of the bills that have been passed. 72% of the bills that have been passed in Parliament have been passed without sending to any standing committee. Any. So if Parliament is not an organ of deliberation, then exactly what purpose does it serve? You know, you have Parliament as a tool to add to the body of knowledge. So what does this mean, right? So in America, if you're the head of a committee, right, if you're a senator who controls a committee, do you know what the budget for your research is? It's $500,000 a year, right? You get a staff of 20 people. And these are not PRS interns, right? These are people who are experts in their field. So if you go to the Congress, you go to the House of Representatives, you have an army in their library of experts. So if you are speaking on labor reform, you will have people who've done a PhD at Brown on labor reform, and they will tell you both ends of the argument. And then you choose how you want to add to the body of knowledge. In the Indian Parliament, if you go to the library, it is the loneliest place in the world. I go to the library all the time. I've never seen one person in the library. You know, the lady who sits at the library, she's always really happy to see me. Bhai sahab, aa jao. The Congressional Research Service, it's called. It hires 600 people. You know how many people our research service hires? That's how many. You know, so what about professionalism in politics, right? So in 1952, we had 1% of people that fell in the category of professional politicians. 1%. 36% were lawyers, you had 9% were journalists, agriculturists, etc., right? In 2014, you have 24% of people that are professional politicians that claim to do and have no other work other than politics. And the truth is, it's more like 80%, right? If we don't have people who've got any life experience, right, or have no interest in life experience, is the wealth of Parliament not going to be constrained? The bureaucracy in India is much, much more powerful than the polity, right? I noticed that in any of the committees I was on, that you would often find people who would come and say, actually, I'm quitting after a few months, and they become friends afterwards. You say, why are you quitting? And say, because I've become a joint secretary. I'll say, but wouldn't you want to become an additional secretary or a secretary? And they'll say, no, actually, we're going into private employment. And so I put an RTI in, right? And what did I find? I wrote an article in the Hindu on this. And what did I find? 30% of all people joint secretary and above have taken premature retirement in the last 10 years. That is a huge amount of people. 36% actually. And I thought, that's strange. Isn't the idea to reach the apex of whatever profession you're in? And you know what's the strangest part? That all of them are working in private employ in the fields in which they served in government. They're not becoming professors and social workers and motivational speakers. I don't want to take any names here, but there's a head of a very, very big bank that went to work as a consultant with somebody that owed 30,000 crore rupees to the same bank at a salary of 12 lakh rupees a month, about 6 times more than his salary. And I'm not making any accusations, except that if a generation of bureaucrats are doing this, then perhaps we're not investing in the right people. Or maybe the right people, after being invested in, are investing it somewhere else. You know, it's what can we look at to solve the problem, right? So, is compulsory voting, is it hegemonic in the worst way? Is it majoritarian? Or is it a means to an end? So there is compulsory voting in Australia, for instance, right? And when I had a chance to meet some MPs from there, I said, but isn't this overtly majoritarian? Doesn't it put the disenfranchised people at a severe disadvantage? And they said, no. They said, because it in fact diminishes socioeconomic bias, because it allows, firstly, poor people vote less than rich people and middle class people in most countries in the world, right? It's not the same in India, but in most countries of the world, like in America, in England, in Germany, poor people by definition vote less because they feel less invested in the system. Does it solve that problem if everybody has an equal say and you have to vote? The second is that does it allow campaigns to focus on messaging other than focusing on getting out the vote? Because in India, everybody's only focusing on mobilizing voters rather than focusing on what is your message as a candidate. I don't know if any of you agree with me, but I think it's something to think about, right? As I talked about short elections. So, what are the solutions? So one of the solutions for all our problems as a nation, or one of the problems, is the opacity of information. The fact is that if in Bangalore you have a road being built and you know that the same road got built last year and you know that something is not right, that's why they're rebuilding the same road, right? Who do you turn to? You don't know your MP, you don't know your MLA, you don't know your corporator, right? Or maybe if you do know them, they're not so, forthcoming with information. Or maybe if you go to see the contractor, he'll tell you to go fly a kite, right? That's what he might say in more colorful language. So what is the answer? Can we have open data platforms of all infrastructural activity, right? So what did I do in my constituency, for instance? So what I did was, me and Captain Sandhu, who handles my constituency, we put all our works, timelines, real time, right? All the time. So for instance, if we are building a road in Ibrahimpur village, right? We will say every 1 week the progress of the road, the contractor building it, how long it's supposed to take vis-a-vis how long it's taking. If there's a delay, what is the reason for the delay? And we've got it all on an open data platform. I promise you, it curbs corruption. Because if everybody has open access to information, I mean, if you knew that the amount of money, see, because politicians love to build stuff. I wonder why, but they love to build stuff, right? And a lot of that cost, the average cost overrun in an irrigation project in India, because I've just written a book on rural India, is 300%. The average cost overrun of an irrigation project. And we're talking about projects not of 50,000 and 1 lakh. We're talking about projects that are 30,000 crores across a state. Now, if you have a 60,000 crore overrun in a poor country, you're taking it out of somebody's pocket. So can we have open data platforms? Europe has, the EU has something called Monithon, which is monitor and marathon put together. And it even tells you the name of the laborers working on a project. So if there are people laying bitumen on a road, it tells you who are those 27 guys, and if they're 3 short that day, why are they short that day? And if you ask a question, you have to, by law, get a response in 24 hours. That's deepening democracy. The other thing is the petition system. All of you want to ask questions of your executive, right? But you can't, because let's say you want to talk about the water problem in Bangalore, right? You want to talk about how, because Bangalore is higher than water sources, it's going to be impossible to pump water up. And so this city is slowly going into desertification, right? So you want your MP to go and do that. Well, it's up to him whether he does it or not. Secondly, it's up to the party whether they give him an opportunity. Third, it's up to his political stature whether the argument gains traction. It's too illogical a process. Why can't we have a petition system? So in England, there is a system whereby if you have 10,000 signatures, if it's even an e-signature, right, you have to get within a week an answer from the Prime Minister's office, 10,000 signatures. But if you have 100,000 signatures, it is discussed in the next session of Parliament by law for 1 hour. So maybe in India the numbers need to be bigger. Maybe it's not 100,000 signatures in India, maybe it can be 500,000 signatures. In the last parliamentary session, I raised my hand and they said yes. And I said, Madam, I'd like to talk about the fact that we have the most polluted cities in the world, and how my daughter, who's 4 years old, goes to school every day wearing a mask. And I want to talk about how in Delhi we have a power plant called the Badarpur power plant, which gives 9% of Delhi electricity and gives 29% particulate matter residue. And how this power plant was built in the 50s, and in America, all technology after 1965 was disbanded, all power plants, because the technology was junk. And why have we got this 1948 power plant running? And she said in Hindi ki, ye mudda prasangik nahi hai, that it's not relevant. And I said, relevant to whom? And she said, no, it's too elitist a concern. And it's only and only the poor that die with this stuff, right? We can get filters and we can get those fancy snaky looking plants and, all that stuff. But a person living in a slum or a low income group housing is going to be living next to that power plant, right? The power plant is not next to my house. It's cloaked nicely in ivy, by the way. So what do we need? I mean, we talk about youth representation in politics, right? So you've got Sebastian Kurz in Austria, who's 31, and you've got Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who's 37. I mean, in India, right? So what are we doing with age? So India is getting younger as a country, so our average age is now 34. And in 1952, our average age was 44. So we're getting younger as our country. In 1952, the average age of an MP was 46, and now the average age of an MP is 58. So our country is getting younger, but our politics is getting older. See, I don't have a problem with young people not coming to the fore. It's just that what kind of young people do we have? Let's be honest, right? The lady here said that she only said one thing about me, which was that my great-grandfather was Pandit Nehru. I was appalled at that introduction, but that's okay, that's India. The fact is that as Indians, right, we need to provoke transformative thought. I wrote this book. It's the third book that I wrote. It's also part of a trilogy. My next book is on urbanization. The next is on the history of Indian people's movements, right? The reason that I took time out to write this book was because I ran a movement to rid farmers of their debt in UP, and we raised 30 crore rupees for farmers' debt. I put in 1 crore of my own money. And we got 4,000 farmers to not fall back into recidivism in their debt. We created transformative plans for each of their individual agriculture. But at the end of it, it's 4,000 people, right? It's nothing. And so I thought, if you want to help 50 crore people, you've got to look at policy reform. That's the only way. And the way to look at policy reform is not to look at Planning Commission or Niti Aayog reports, or ICRIA data. It's to get off your high horse and just rough it out. And that's what I hope that I did. The last part of my intervention is on the expanding role of the citizen, because that is why I've come here, and that is the solution to all of our problems. I was in Bengal and I was looking at rural education, and I wanted to know why Murshidabad has gone from 39% literacy in 20 years to almost 80% literacy. And I asked some people and they said, talk to Babar Ali. And I said, who the hell is Babar Ali? And they said, well, come and find out. So I went there, and I went to a small village called Bhapta. And I want to tell two stories. This is the first one of them. And Babar, when he was 9, was the only kid in his family who would go to school. And he would feel very guilty about it. And he said he would come back, and underneath a guava tree, he would teach the other kids in the village what he learned that day. And lots of people got inspired by this young school teacher. And so people from other villages started sending their children just for a little bit of time. And somebody would send chalk, and somebody would send paper, etc. And then CNN heard about him. Nobody in the Indian media had ever, of course, heard about him. But CNN heard about him, so they gave him one of their Heroes of the Year award. They give 20 people a Heroes of the Year award, and they gave him, I think it was, at that time, $50,000, a princely sum. And had it been any other person, rich, poor, middle class, they would have put it in the bank, or bought land, or built a big pakka house. But Babar said, no, this money has come from education, it will go back into education. So he did a shramdan in his village. He got people to give their labor free, and they built a big school, as big as this room probably, or a little bigger. And he said that there are only 3 rules in this school. 1, everybody who studies will study free. 2nd, people who teach will teach free. 3rd, everybody who studies will go back to their village and teach 2 people what they've learned that day. And slowly, villages started getting competitive. And they said, if Bhapta can do it, why can't we do it? And they did. And they put 100% of their village funds into education. Today, it's a 68 village education hub. And everybody in those 68 villages is 100% educated because of one boy. I was talking about, female gender pay gap. And next to Sultanpur, where I'm an MP from, is Ambedkar Nagar. And one girl who was a scheduled caste girl called Shimla Kumari, one day, she was a laborer at a brick kiln. So she went to work, and the guy said, I'm sorry, there's no work for you, can go home. And she said, but you haven't paid me for 2 days. And he said, you can, shove off, and there's nothing in it for you. And she said, okay. And she was a bit frightened, and she went to the labor commissioner, where she recognized somebody who was a relative of a relative of a relative, who was the chaprasi there. And she said, would you please just get me a minute with the big boss man? And he said, yeah, of course I will. And so he took her in, and she said, Saab, 2 din ke paise nahi mile, dehadi, what you call daily wages. And he said, okay, I'll get it for you, that's not an issue. And he said, how much do you make? And she said, I make 60 rupees a day. And he said, no, that's not possible, because the government ordained rate is 120 rupees a day for a full day of work. And she said, the men get 120 rupees a day, and the women get 60 rupees a day. And I would urge you to go to Kolar and Chikbalapur and Mandya and wherever, like I went, and go to brick kilns, go to textile units, and you will see, particularly all the ladies here, that the women get exactly half for the same work as the men get, all across this country. And this woman said, and this guy was a brilliant guy, and he said, this shouldn't be the case. And so he gave her a car and 2 educated people. And he said, just go all around your district and just take signatures and affidavits of women that will sign saying they've worked for this long and this is what they've got. And they paid back payments of 68 crore rupees to the poorest women in India because of one woman. And the last example, the end of my speech, is just, often we feel that life has not been fair to us, right? And I met Shrikant Bola. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. Shrikant was born completely blind. And he was born totally blind, and he had a passion for learning. So he wanted to do science in his +2, and the school said, we can't have you do science because you're blind. So how will you do the experiments? How will you do all of this? And he said, I'll do it. And they said, you can't. So he went to court in Hyderabad, and the court said the child can do whatever he wants. And he got 99% in his +2. After that, he applied to IIT, and he got into IIT Delhi to do mechanical engineering. And then IIT refused to take him because they said, how can we have a blind person here? This was back in the day. How will you live? How will you bathe? We can't have people taking you to the mess and to classes. I'm sorry. And so he said, okay, I don't want to kick up a fuss. So he took a gap year and he applied to MIT. And he's the first Indian to get a full scholarship at MIT. And then he went to MIT and he did astrophysics, which, as you know, is astrophysics, is tough stuff. And he got a gold medal, and he topped it. And after that, NASA, Google, Oracle, HP, everybody said, Shrikant, come and work with us. And he said no. And he came back to India and he set up Bolland Industries. Today, I think it's a 400 crore company now. And it hires 2,500 people, out of which 1,500 people are completely blind. So he just paid it forward. And so when I met people like this across my book is an extremely technical academic book. But the journeys that I undertook were, life-changing. And I just want to end by saying that, politics is not the other, right? We live in an era of unprecedented information exchange, right? It is up to us to indulge in civic partnerships. It is up to us to recognize the true value and the true idea of democracy. And it is up to us to work as a collective, to partner in some great change. I've come here today. I don't know if any of you are on Twitter or on Facebook, but I would like you to reach out to me, not to tell me that this is good or bad, but to tell me what issues you wish I would fight for. Because that's why we go across the countries. We go to build relationships and to take those relationships forward. And I come to Bangalore quite often to speak, and I was thrilled to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gandhi. I'd like to now...
It's okay, I'll take questions. So, gentlemen there. So there are 3 or 4, 5 questions. I'll take them all and then we'll do lunch. Yeah, I can probably hear you, sir.
Okay. First, I want to congratulate you
Thank
for
you.
an excellent presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Realistically, for us. I have 2 questions, but before
Just take
that,
one, sir, because there's a few people.
2 questions to you.
Yeah, that's fine.
But before that,
As Dorothy Parker said,
there is something
age
in this
before
article
beauty.
which is very special to us.
Yeah.
There is only one member of parliament in the country who had spent all the MP local area development fund for the sake of the people. That is you. So in a parliament, in the largest democracy of the world, called India,
Thank you.
if 30% of the members of the parliament are criminals, do we need a parliament like that? That is one question.
Okay, I'll answer
Wait,
this.
wait. Second, you have written this great book, From the Fields. Maybe as it was introduced by her, after Jawaharlal Nehru, discovery of India, Probably this is the best book that we have. Discovery of India from the villages of India. Congratulations to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
This
I
is
just- I-
for the youth of India. Now,
just wanna say-
have,
No, that's all. Please, let him speak. We
no,
are
I
short
will
of time.
please
We have
it,
to fly-
and then you
fly,
can
please.
answer.
Sorry.
Can we, in the Parliament of India next, discuss two issues? Who owns India? Who controls India? Who owns India? The ownership of India. Number two, can there be inheritance everywhere in India? All the political parties are inherited parties nowadays. All the leaders are inherited. Can we change the democracy of
Yeah.
India? Greatest democracy of the world, called America, 3 years ago has given me a notice
Sir.
that I will be arrested and sent to Mexico as a permanent guest forever, because I went and asked a question to America, why you never had a woman in the White House? That is what is necessary for both the democracies of the world to
Mexico
change.
is a beautiful country, by the way. Trotsky was in Mexico, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He lived with Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera in Casa Azul. Beautiful. Go to Punta Mita if you're in Mexico. Yeah, so there was a bunch of questions, but I'd like to answer one or two, and I will come to you afterwards. The first question on criminalization of politics. Okay, so there are two kinds of criminal cases. One that are heaped on you if you're in a political struggle, right? So those have to be looked at through a bit of a deeper lens. But the second kind of criminal cases, which are the most heinous ones, like rape, like murder, like arson, or like all of them. So there are 4 MPs in Parliament today that have rape cases on them. And I can only hope that they're false cases. But really, we need to look at who we're giving tickets to, you know, because like you said, we have an example to follow. Yeah. I'm so sorry. I've forgotten the rest of your questions, to be honest. Because, yeah, and on dynasty and all that. You know, the thing is that I agree with you that dynastic politics is crippling the talent pool in India. It's true. It's true. But I tell you where I'm hopeful. Young people, middle class people, working people, all across the country now are more self-aware than they were, say, 20 years ago. They're stronger, they're more united in their focus, in their voice, in their aspirations, a much abused word. But I will say this, which is that 20 years later, people will demand more from their leadership. And they will ask them, what have you done outside of politics? Why should I consider you a serious voice? Is it enough that you're electable? These questions are being asked as we speak more and more stridently year upon the year. So politicians will have to be on their game. They'll have to perform at the highest level. And if they don't, then they will perish, irrespective of whether they come from family X or family Z. And that's an upward trajectory morally and materially for the future of this country. So I'm hopeful. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Okay, my name is Pooja Yaduvir, and I don't know whether my question here is prasangik as of now, but I belong to Fauji fraternity, and today whatever I heard from you was very interesting and very knowledgeable at the same time. So I'm very intrigued to have your views upon the military or the things that are related to defense going on, like a lot of changes, if I may sound a little cribbity also, like taking away the rations or the OROP that we talk about. So what is your take on the military position as of now in India? And I just want to know your views.
Yeah, so I think it's an excellent question. And it's a question that I don't really have a very informed answer to. but I've written on this, etc., and I'm very pro OROP, etc. But I will say this, which is that my mother's father was, I was just telling the colonel that my mother's father was a colonel in the army. He was in the signals. And my Masi's husband was also a colonel in the army in Hodson's Horse, in Armored Corps 4 Horse. So, I mean, I have a huge reverence for the army. And, you know, it's probably the finest group of people in the country. No religious bias, no caste bias, no regional bias. And maybe we need to look at a system where we have recruitment in the army, what is it called, conscription in the army for 1 year, compulsorily for all young people. And I'll tell you why. I mean, it sounds like a bit of a headache, but I'll tell you what, they will go in as boys and they will come out as men, because they will come out more disciplined, more humble, team players. You know, as politicians, you're not always taught all these things, you know. And when you fight as a Fauji, or when you stand as a Fauji, even if you don't fight, you're subscribing to an ideal that's larger than yourself. So it's you know, soul elevating. So yeah. But I'd like to get into the specifics, but another time. And anybody else? Yeah, you had a question? Yeah, the gentleman at the back. The rest I'll answer during lunch. Yes. Yeah, I can probably hear you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring speech. I can't but take a dig to suggest that I can't say the same about another gentleman who shares your illustrious surname. But
Mahatma Gandhi?
I've actually...
What are you talking about?
I've had the opportunity to glance through your book, and I have to congratulate you on it. Monumental piece of work. Could you just tell us a little bit of what went into writing that book, and if any recommendations have been accepted by the ruling party as well? Thank you.
Yeah, so for instance, one recommendation, which is, for instance, I asked for the expansion of Manrega, because as you know, a lot of people weren't pro-Manrega, but I went and I gave my presentation to a lot of secretaries of the government of India together, and also I gave my suggestions to the team that was doing the budget, and I talked very specifically about Manrega because I think it's an excellent scheme. Yes, when you do a scheme that size, there will be mistakes. There's a district in Punjab called Moga, where they decided to do just farm to market roads. And 1 year after they had spent 170 crores, they found that every single village had a farm to market road. So every scheme has loopholes, but yeah, we need to look at deepening democracy through economic criteria. The book is big on decentralization. It's big on doing academic study before getting into projects. You know, it talks about water, it talks about labor. It basically talks about how the village, which cannot now exist as an independent economic unit, can exist as an interdependent economic unit. So I'll just end by saying one thing. All of us know about India being called a sone ki chidiya. See, because if I talk about pesticides and fertilizers, a lot of people here will switch off. But do you know where that phrase came from, sone ki chidiya? It came from Vasco da Gama, who went to Calicut for calico, which is unfinished cotton, and silk. And he said, India is like a golden bird waiting to take flight. And that was the richest India had ever been. But all those boom towns like Mangalgiri and Chanderi and Bhadoi, all of them are ghost towns today. Bangladesh, which the economy has done a huge turnaround, is now spending, what, 17% on textiles of GDP, right? That's where the jobs come from. So I'll tell you a statistic. 24 lakh rupees in India creates one sustainable steel job. 1 lakh rupees in handloom creates 9 sustainable jobs. So what should we be looking at as a country? Thank you.
Thank you very much.